Some people inherit a throne, a fortune, or an empire so powerful it should survive anything. Then they somehow destroy it faster than a drunk guy handling fireworks. In this video, we are counting down 33 heirs who got handed everything and still managed to wreck kingdoms, dynasties, and family empires with panic, vanity, delusion, or plain world-class stupidity. 1. Emperor Qinzong of Song did not inherit a calm throne. He inherited a nightmare. The Jurchen Jin army was already hammering at the capital, Kaifeng, and the dynasty needed disciplined military command, not fantasy roleplay. Instead of trusting capable generals, the court lurched into superstition and panic. One notorious episode says Qinzong put faith in a local wonderworker who promised thousands of magical soldiers and supernatural protection for the city. That is the kind of decision you make when your empire is being run by fear in silk robes. The result was catastrophic. Kaifeng fell, Qinzong was captured with his father, and the northern Song effectively collapsed. He inherited a huge state and, under pressure, chose vibes over strategy. History is absolutely full of bad decisions, but opening the door for a magic fix while an invasion is already underway is elite-level incompetence. 2. Huntington Hartford inherited one of America's great retail fortunes, the A&P supermarket money. The kind of fortune that should buy you several generations of safety even if you are only half awake. Hartford was not half awake. He was energetically weird. He poured enormous sums into Paradise Island in the Bahamas, into modern art projects that bled cash, and into side quests like a handwriting institute, because apparently ordinary rich person mistakes were too boring. For years he lived like a glamorous cultural prince, funding things that sounded elegant and ended like financial sinkholes. This was not one bad bet. This was a lifestyle built around setting money on fire in expensive neighborhoods. By the end, the man born into supermarket dynasty wealth was living far more modestly and renting a house. He did not lose everything in a single explosion. He bled it away with taste, confidence, and absolutely no breaks. 3. Emperor Honorius inherited the Western Roman Empire at the exact moment when Western Roman Empire was becoming less a government and more a slow public collapse. The most famous story about him is probably apocryphal, but honestly it survives because it feels emotionally true. When he was told that Rome has perished, he supposedly panicked because he thought they meant his favorite chicken, which was named Rome. When the messenger clarified that no, actually it was the city that had been sacked, he was relieved. Again, the chicken was the priority. Even if the anecdote was polished by later writers, it captures the basic problem perfectly. A ruler in Ravenna, detached from reality, presiding over disintegration while the old capital fell to the Visigoths. Imagine inheriting Rome and somehow coming off like a man whose biggest concern is poultry inventory. That is less emperor behavior and more badly managed farm energy. 4. Patrick Reynolds is the weirdest case on this list because he did, technically, attack his family legacy, but for a good reason. He came from the R.J. Reynolds tobacco dynasty, which meant he inherited money built on one of the most profitable legal habits in human history. Then he looked at the family business, looked at what cigarettes actually do to people, and basically said, yeah, no, this is awful. Instead of defending the dynasty, he became one of the most visible anti-smoking activists in America. He sold his tobacco stock, publicly condemned the industry, testified, campaigned, and spent years helping dismantle the moral prestige of the empire his family had built. So yes, this is destruction, but in the rare noble sense. Most heirs on this list wrecked their inheritance because they were foolish, lazy, or deranged. Patrick Reynolds tried to wreck his because he decided conscience mattered more than dividends. Honestly, that is almost suspiciously respectable for this lineup. 5. Sultan Ibrahim the Mad inherited the Ottoman Empire after years of trauma, confinement, and paranoia in the palace cage system that turned princes into nervous wrecks before they ever reached the throne. So when he finally got power, the results were not exactly reassuring. Contemporary and later accounts describe a ruler obsessed with luxury, furs, and sexual fixation, especially with very large women, while governance slid into chaos around him. He became famous less for statecraft than for compulsions, indulgence, and court madness. This is the problem with inheriting one of the world's most formidable empires while being psychologically shredded before your first official decree. Ibrahim did not build authority. He dissolved it into spectacle. The government staggered, elites lost patience, and eventually he was deposed and killed by strangulation. When your own guards decide the empire is safer without you breathing, that is not a great performance review. 6. Sir George Sitwell inherited rank, land, and the kind of wealth that should have produced either a serious statesman or a harmless country gentleman. Instead, it produced a glorious aristocratic eccentric who treated money like a research grant for nonsense. Sitwell became famous for bizarre inventions, including a musical toothbrush and a tiny pistol designed for shooting wasps, which is somehow both absurdly petty and weirdly impressive. You can almost hear the Victorian servant standing nearby, watching the boss spend family wealth engineering personal revenge on insects. The tragedy here is not one spectacular collapse, but a slow surrender of aristocratic responsibility to private eccentricity. Plenty of heirs waste money on cards, horses, or mistresses. Sitwell decided to become a one-man museum of overfunded nonsense. There is something almost admirable about the commitment. If you are going to squander inherited prestige, at least do it with enough style that future generations have to explain the phrase musical toothbrush with a straight face. 7. Caligula inherited the Roman Empire with a full treasury left by Tiberius, and then proceeded to treat that treasury like a challenge coin. Ancient sources love exaggeration with Caligula, so you have to read them with gloves on, but the broad picture is clear. He burned through massive wealth fast, staged extravagant spectacles, pushed imperial display into grotesque theater, and turned rule into performance art with a death wish. The horse-made consul story is probably more insult, threat, or dark joke than literal appointment. But the fact that it sounds believable tells you everything. He wanted power to feel humiliating for everyone else. He built, flaunted, mocked, and spent like the empire existed to fund his personal chaos. Rome could survive military strain, political struggle, even bad rulers. What it hates is an emperor who behaves like the treasury is a party prop. Caligula got 4 years. It felt like 40. 8. Edward VIII inherited not just a kingdom, but the largest empire on earth, a global machine with colonies, dominions, ceremony, prestige, and enough inherited symbolism to crush a normal person flat. He kept it for less than a year. The 1936 abdication crisis was not some cute romantic tantrum with a violin soundtrack. It was a constitutional meltdown because the king insisted on marrying Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee, and the governments of Britain and the Dominions would not accept her as queen. So he made the ultimate royal rage quit. He chose the marriage and walked away from the throne. There is a strange purity to it. Other heirs cling to power while ruining everything around them. Edward looked at the crown, looked at the restrictions attached to it, and basically said, "Then keep it." It is one of history's cleanest examples of inheriting everything, and instantly discovering that duty was not really your thing. 9. Edgar Bronfman Jr. inherited Seagram, a liquor empire so stable and profitable it practically printed dynastic permanence. Then he decided he did not want to be the steward of a cash machine. He wanted to be a media emperor. That impulse led Seagram away from its dependable base and toward entertainment, especially Universal. To feed that dream, the company sold off hugely valuable assets, including the DuPont stake that had been doing a lot of the heavy lifting. It was a classic heir move, boredom with the boring business that made the family rich in the first place. Hollywood glamour beat whiskey discipline. For a while it looked bold. Then it looked expensive. Then it looked disastrous. By the time the Vivendi mess had done its work, the multi-generational family fortune had taken a brutal hit and the old Seagram identity was effectively gone. This is what happens when an heir decides predictable profit is too uncool. 10. Louis X of France inherited a strong Capetian kingdom and managed to leave behind one of those deaths that sounds made up by a bored medieval screenwriter. He loved jeu de paume, the ancestor of tennis, and became associated with the sport so strongly that later chroniclers basically turned his final days into a royal cautionary tale. The famous version says he played hard, overheated, drank cold wine, fell ill, and died. Whether that exact sequence is perfectly accurate or not, the point is brutal. A young king dies suddenly, the treasury is strained, and the succession turns into a mess. Louis did not just leave a throne, he left instability, disputed inheritance, and another shove toward the dynastic crisis that helped break the Capetian line. Imagine inheriting France and ending your reign with the historical energy of local sports enthusiast drinks the wrong beverage at the worst possible time. Medieval monarchy really did not believe in soft landings. 11. Evalyn Walsh McLean inherited mining wealth and used it like she had made a personal vow never to experience moderation for even 10 consecutive minutes. She bought the Hope Diamond, leaned into its cursed reputation like it was part of the brand package, and turned excess into a social lifestyle. Her parties were legendary, huge, glittering, and often so absurd that even the dog got luxury treatment, including one famous celebration where the Hope Diamond was reportedly worn on the dog's collar. That is not rich. That is cartoon rich. But beneath the sparkle was the classic second-generation problem. Wealth without breaks, glamour without discipline, and tragedy circling the family. By the end, the estate was financially wrecked and the jewels had to be sold off. She inherited one of those fortunes that look indestructible from the outside. Then she treated it like a prop department budget for the Roaring '20s and found out very late that even giant fortunes can drown in champagne. 12. Atahualpa is one of the most brutal examples of winning everything and then losing it almost immediately. He inherited half the Inca world, fought a savage civil war against his brother Huascar, and emerged as sole ruler of a massive empire just in time to make one fatal misread. Francisco Pizarro arrived with only about 168 Spaniards, which on paper should have made them look less like conquerors and more like a very suspicious field trip. But Atahualpa underestimated the danger, agreed to meet them at Cajamarca, and walked into an ambush. In one afternoon, the ruler of an empire commanding tens of thousands of soldiers was seized by a tiny foreign force using shock, horses, steel, firearms, and perfect opportunism. The Spanish did not conquer the Inca in a single moment, but the capture of Atahualpa smashed the spine of the whole system. Few heirs have ever held absolute power so briefly before watching history kick the floor out from under them. 13. August. Busch IV inherited one of America's most iconic family empires, Anheuser-Busch, and became the last Busch to run it before the whole thing was swallowed by InBev. Now, to be fair, giant corporate takeovers are more complicated than one guy partied too much and lost the kingdom. But Busch carried a hard-partying reputation for years, attracted legal drama, and never exactly projected the calm discipline of a dynastic steward guarding a 150-year-old fortress. He was a marketer, a showman, and a Busch in the old public style. But the family's grip was already weaker than the mythology suggested. When InBev came in, the result was the end of family control over the brewery that had defined the dynasty. That is what makes this one sting. The name stayed legendary, the inheritance did not. He did not exactly smash the beer empire with a hammer, but he was absolutely the man in charge when the family finally lost the tap. 14. Theodore I of Russia inherited the throne from Ivan the Terrible, which is roughly like inheriting a haunted mansion from a man who had also been setting fires in the basement. Theodore was pious, gentle, and profoundly unsuited for direct rule. He cared more about prayer and church ritual than power politics, and became so associated with religious devotion that he was remembered as a bell-ringer king. The real business of government slid into the hands of Boris Godunov, his brother-in-law, while Theodore drifted through the ceremonial shell of monarchy. On one level, he was not wicked. He just had no appetite for the brutal management required to hold together a hard state built by a terrifying father. Then came the fatal dynastic detail. He died without a surviving son. That ended the central Rurik line and helped push Russia into the time of troubles. Few heirs have ever destroyed a dynasty so thoroughly through passivity alone. 15. Harry K. Thaw inherited a coal fortune and used it to transform one public murder into a years-long financial bonfire. In 1906, he shot architect Stanford White in front of a crowd at Madison Square Garden, which is already an insane sentence. Then came the trials, the spectacle, the legal teams, the asylum fights, the endless money hemorrhage that only a rich heir could sustain. Thaw did not merely commit a notorious crime. He funded a private madness industry around himself. Lawyers, doctors, juries, institutions, newspapers, everybody got dragged into the orbit of one spoiled millionaire who could afford to keep his own catastrophe going. This is what inherited money does when it merges with obsession and entitlement. It turns consequences into expensive theater. By the end, a fortune that should have anchored a dynasty had become fuel for scandal, litigation, confinement, and tabloid immortality. He spent family wealth not on empire building, but on preserving his own personal disaster. 16. Charles VI of France inherited a crown that had been strengthened by his father, Charles V, who had clawed back much of France's position against England. In other words, the setup was good. Then Charles VI's mind broke. His reign became a parade of episodes so bizarre that later generations still sound unsure whether to laugh, pity him, or quietly back away. He forgot his own name, failed to recognize his family, and became associated with the famous glass delusion, the belief that he was made of glass and might shatter. A king ruling in terror of becoming shattered pottery is not ideal when your kingdom is already under pressure. His illness did not just cripple the monarchy personally. It invited factional warfare, regency struggles, and foreign opportunism. England benefited, Burgundians maneuvered, and France drifted toward humiliation. He inherited a recovering kingdom and turned it into a psychiatric waiting room with banners. 17. Richard Cromwell inherited England from Oliver Cromwell, which sounds powerful until you remember he inherited not a stable dynasty, but a military-political contraption held together by his father's prestige, fear, and sheer force of personality. Richard had none of that. No battlefield authority, no charisma, no ability to dominate the army, and no political instinct strong enough to stop the machine from shaking itself apart. He became Lord Protector and then spent roughly 9 months proving that inheritance is not the same thing as legitimacy. The army distrusted him, Parliament did not rescue him, and the whole protectorate started to sag like wet cardboard. His enemies called him Tumbledown Dick, which is one of history's most efficient nicknames because it contains the entire verdict in 3 words. He did not just lose a government. He lost the entire Republican experiment so completely that the monarchy came back. That is a very aggressive way to fail an audition. 18. Thor Batista is a slightly different kind of heir disaster because he was not the executive mastermind who personally tanked the EBX empire. His father, Ike Batista, did plenty of that on his own. But Thor became the perfect public symbol of dynastic excess right before the family collapse. He grew up as the son of Brazil's richest man, surrounded by supercars, headlines, bodybuilder glamour, and the kind of public wealth flexing that practically dares fate to show up with a baseball bat. Then came the fatal crash in his father's Mercedes, the endless attention, and the broader implosion of the Batista fortune as the supposedly unstoppable business machine started collapsing under debt and fantasy valuations. Thor became the face people remembered, the kid of absurd privilege standing at the edge of a family free fall. Sometimes an heir destroys the brand by bad management. Sometimes he destroys it just by becoming its most unforgettable billboard. 19. Commodus inherited the empire of Marcus Aurelius and the long stability people later called the Pax Romana. That is an absurdly strong hand to be dealt. He responded by treating imperial dignity like a costume trunk. He had little patience for actual administration, loved arena performance, styled himself as Hercules, fought as a gladiator, and according to ancient sources delighted in killing animals in public displays, including the famous ostrich episode that left senators trying not to laugh themselves into execution. At the same time, he devalued the currency and turned imperial rule into a blend of vanity project and live-action ego worship. Rome could survive harsh emperors. It had trouble with emperors who thought the empire existed mainly to applaud them. Ancient writers absolutely hated Commodus, so you allow for exaggeration, but even with that allowance the verdict is ugly. He inherited gold and left rust. That is about as clear a downgrade as history offers. 20. Peter Stroh inherited a thriving American brewing dynasty and managed to turn a strong family business into a debt-soaked cautionary tale. The Stroh name had survived wars, markets, and generations. Then came the big strategic gamble, buying rivals and expanding with borrowed money in a beer market that was already turning brutal. Instead of staying disciplined, the company overreached, especially with major acquisitions that looked bold on paper and horrifying on the balance sheet. This is the corporate version of a man buying 3 more houses because he thinks confidence is a revenue stream. It was not. Debt piled up, competition squeezed hard, and the fortune that had once seemed untouchable collapsed fast enough to leave hundreds of heirs with a lot less than the family legend promised. Stroh is a perfect example of modern dynastic ruin. No palace coups, no assassins, no magical soldiers, just leverage, hubris, and a spreadsheet quietly sharpening a knife. 21. Ludwig II of Bavaria inherited a kingdom and became history's patron saint of beautiful financial irresponsibility. He was not a boring administrator, which is the kindest possible way to say he preferred fantasy, art, and architecture to the practical business of ruling. He poured staggering sums into palace projects, above all the fairy tale castles that made him famous, and into his devotion to Wagner. Neuschwanstein is now a postcard dream. At the time, it was a giant stone announcement that the king had confused governance with private myth-making. There is some nuance here because historians still debate exactly how much of the debt was personal versus state pressure, and the diagnosis of his madness remains controversial. But politically, the result was the same. Ministers used debt and eccentricity to declare him unfit and remove him. He inherited a crown and spent his reign behaving like a dreamy production designer who accidentally had access to a throne. 22. Emperor Jianwen inherited the Ming throne from his terrifying grandfather, the Hongwu Emperor, who had built the dynasty with iron, paranoia, and enough executions to darken a calendar. Jianwen's first big move was to cut down the power of his princely uncles, who had armies, territories, and every reason to take that personally. In theory, centralizing control sounds sensible. In practice, trying to disarm heavily armed royal uncles without first ensuring they cannot revolt is how you accidentally invent your own disaster. The most dangerous uncle, Zhu Di, Prince of Yan, did exactly what any ambitious warlord prince would do. He rebelled. The civil war became the Jingnan campaign. Nanjing fell, the palace burned, and Jianwen either died in the fire or vanished into one of history's great imperial question marks. 4 years after inheriting China, he was gone. That is not a reign. That is a very expensive warning label. 23. Horace Dodge Jr. was born into automotive royalty and somehow turned all that industrial muscle into the energy of a permanently unsupervised yacht club. He was the son of one of the Dodge founders, meaning he inherited access to serious wealth, serious brand prestige, and serious opportunity. What he preferred was speedboats, racing, parties, serial marriages, and the rich boy drift that happens when discipline never fully arrives. Contemporary and later descriptions paint him as charming, reckless, and under constant financial supervision precisely because he had a spendthrift streak that worried the adults around him. That is never a great sign. Instead of becoming a hard-edged steward of the family legacy, he became one more example of how second-generation heirs can confuse mobility with purpose. Boats, glamour, nights out, another marriage, another check. He did not give the family empire a glorious continuation. He gave it expensive static. 24. Selim II inherited the Ottoman Empire from Suleiman the Magnificent, which is roughly like inheriting the world's most intimidating machine after the greatest operator it ever had. Selim's nickname, the Drunkard, was not exactly subtle, and his reign became famous for delegation, indulgence, and a sharp decline in the image of the warrior sultan. He was the first Ottoman ruler not to personally lead an army on campaign, leaving real power heavily in the hands of capable ministers like Sokolu Mehmed Pasha. That kept the empire functioning, but it also made the contrast with his father painfully obvious. The mythic center had softened. Then came the ending so absurd it feels scripted. According to the traditional story, he died after slipping on wet marble in a bath while drunk. Imagine inheriting Suleiman's empire and exiting history like a rich uncle after a disastrous spa weekend. That is a difficult act to defend. 25. Isabel dos Santos inherited the modern version of empire, not a crown, but access. She was the daughter of Angola's longtime president and built a vast business network through state-linked assets, strategic appointments, and the kind of political backing that makes ordinary capitalism look adorable. For years, she was presented as Africa's richest woman, the symbol of dynastic success in a petrostate. Then her father left office and the whole structure started wobbling almost immediately. The new government froze assets, investigations spread, the Luanda leaks exposed the machinery behind the fortune, and companies that had looked untouchable suddenly looked very touchable indeed. This is the crucial lesson of political inheritance. If your empire depends on dad still sitting in the chair, it is not an empire. It is a rented costume. The second the old regime ended, the spell broke, and billions in prestige turned into lawyers, court orders, and frozen accounts. For 26. Wladislaus II of Hungary, also called Wladislaus, inherited 2 crowns and still managed to feel like a tenant in his own kingdoms. He became famous for endlessly saying dobrzy, meaning essentially very well, to whatever the nobles demanded. Now, being agreeable sounds pleasant at dinner. It is not a functioning model of kingship when magnates are actively stripping the crown for parts. His willingness to approve aristocratic demands weakened royal authority, damaged the treasury, and helped dissolve the strong centralized system Matthias Corvinus had built before him. The Black Army disappeared, resources dried up, and the monarchy became softer, poorer, and more dependent on elite goodwill. This is one of history's classic cases of passive ruin. He was not a theatrical maniac or a glittering lunatic. He was something far more dangerous in a hard political world: accommodating. If every noble asks for your power and you answer, very well, pretty soon the throne is just an expensive chair. 27. Reginald Claypool. Vanderbilt inherited old American Titan money and proceeded to behave like the family fortune was an unlimited beverage that refilled itself every morning. He loved gambling, racing, horses, society life, and all the aristocratic leisure habits that look glamorous, right? Until the accountant starts sweating through his collar. Reggie was not building railroads, controlling industry, or extending the family power base. He was consuming it. By the time he died young, worn down by alcoholism, much of his inheritance had already been torched in the grand Vanderbilt tradition of confusing limitless wealth with limitless endurance. This is what makes the Vanderbilts such a perfect dynasty for American overreach. The first generation builds the machine. Later generations assume the machine is immortal and proceed to sit on it with a drink in one hand and betting slips in the other. Reggie did not ruin the family alone, but he absolutely helped keep the fire hot. 28. Henry III of France inherited a kingdom already tearing itself apart in the wars of religion, which means he walked into office with the political equivalent of a room full of gasoline and angry priests. What did he add to the mix? Court spectacle, controversy, elite favorites, and an image so strange that hostile contemporaries never stopped talking about it. His mignons, his fashionable extravagance, the endless gossip about dress, luxury, and performance at court all fed the sense that while France bled, the king was curating an aesthetic. Reports of his lapdogs multiplied into legend, because of course they did. Nothing enrages a fractured kingdom like the impression that the throne is busy accessorizing. To be fair, propaganda against him was fierce and often vicious. But politics is not only about truth. It is about atmosphere, and Henry's atmosphere was fatal. He ended up stabbed by the Dominican friar Jacques Clément. Inheriting civil war and then becoming a symbol of decadent detachment is a very dangerous hobby. 29. Jonathan Guinness, the third Baron Moyne, inherited one of those surnames that ought to come with built-in financial safety features. Guinness is supposed to sound like old money, institutional caution, and a cellar full of permanence. Then came the Truster affair, one of those ugly financial messes where millions vanish and suddenly everyone in the room looks like they need separate lawyers. Guinness became entangled in a spectacular corporate scandal around the Swedish investment company Truster, where huge sums effectively walked out the door. Whether you frame him as villain, dupe, or rich man who wandered into a shark tank wearing confidence as armor, the result was the same. Reputational wreckage, missing millions, and a very public reminder that inherited status does not automatically make you hard to scam. Some heirs gamble at casinos. Others do it in boardrooms with titles, shell structures, and the illusion that aristocratic composure counts as due diligence. It does not. 30. Ptolemy IV inherited Egypt at the tail end of Ptolemaic greatness, and then handed vast practical power to favorites while indulging himself in luxury and court excess. Ancient sources portray him as feeble, pleasure-loving, and heavily managed by the people around him, especially the clique that ran government while he enjoyed being king more than actually governing. He is also associated with the giant royal barge called the Thalamigos, basically a floating palace, because apparently ruling from ordinary land was insufficiently theatrical. Some traditions even make him a dabbler in literature, the kind of ruler who fancies himself cultured while the state quietly loosens at the joints. Egypt did not vanish overnight under him, but the tone changed. Internal instability deepened, native revolt stirred, and the long downward slope of Ptolemaic decline is often traced to his reign. He inherited a golden machine and treated it like an over-decorated pleasure yacht. 31. Louis XV inherited France at the peak of Bourbon prestige, with the shadow of the Sun King still looming over Europe. That should have been enough political capital for a careful ruler to live comfortably for decades. Instead, Louis became attached to the softest possible philosophy of kingship. Enjoy now, invoice later. The phrase, "after me the flood," is traditionally linked to him or to Madame de Pompadour. And even if historians argue over the exact context, the phrase sticks because it fits the mood perfectly. Court luxury, mistresses, factional politics, and costly wars all helped drag the monarchy deeper into fiscal trouble. His foreign policy failures weakened France, and the crown's inability to solve its financial problems poisoned the system passed on to his successors. He did not personally see the revolution. He did something almost more impressive. He helped arrange the furniture so that his grandson could meet it face first. Dynastic sabotage with good manners. 32. Qin Er Shi, also known as Hu Hai, inherited the First Chinese Empire under circumstances already soaked in intrigue. After Qin Shi Huang died, the succession turned into a palace conspiracy involving forged orders, court manipulation, and the sidelining of the rightful heir, Fu Su. Whether you emphasize the forged will tradition or the broader coup atmosphere, the effect was the same. Hu Hai came to the throne through deceit and then governed through terror. He killed siblings, obeyed poisonous advisors like Zhao Gao, and intensified the brutality of a dynasty that was already stretched thin by forced labor, heavy punishments, and elite fear. This is the speedrun version of imperial collapse. Qin had unified China through ruthless efficiency. Qin Er Shi inherited that machine and made it even more paranoid while rebellions multiplied everywhere. 3 years later, the dynasty was collapsing. His father built the first empire. The son turned it into a demolition site before the concrete had fully dried. 33. Charles II of Spain inherited the remains of a giant empire that was already creaking, but his reign turned that creak into a funeral soundtrack. He was the last Spanish Habsburg, physically wrecked by generations of inbreeding, chronically ill, and unable to produce an heir. His personal suffering was real and not funny, so this is one of the few stories on the list where the absurdity gives way to pure dynastic tragedy. Still, the political effect was devastating. Court factions fought over influence, Spanish finances remained in chronic crisis, and the monarchy's weakness became obvious to Europe. Charles did not single-handedly create Spain's decline, which had deeper roots, but he became its final symbol: an emperor in title, a broken body in practice, and the dead end of a family so obsessed with preserving bloodline purity that it ended up breeding political extinction. When he died childless, he left Europe a succession war in Spain, the bill for centuries of dynastic arrogance. Now, settle this properly in the comments. Who was the single worst heir on this list, and who did we not mention that absolutely deserved a spot? I want the most embarrassing collapse, the most pathetic fumble, and the most infuriating spoiled disaster. Drop your pick below. And if this is your kind of history, hit like, subscribe, and stick around for more spectacular human failure.